Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 58, Chicago Noir. Welcome back to Point Blank. My name is Kurt, and joining me once again, here's Justin.
Hey Kurt, long time no see and no talk. How are you?
Well, I'm doing pretty good. Here we are, ready to talk about Chicago Noir. That's pretty exciting to me. It's probably even more exciting to you since we're essentially returning to your home turf.
Yeah, it's strange. I haven't lived in the Chicago area since I was 18, except for visiting family and such, and I never had a super strong connection to Chicago. I was always looking to escape where I was, as many young people, are. And in the past few years, I've been reflecting on that distance and thinking about Chicago more fondly, all the sports teams, the food, a lot of the stuff's in my DNA and I just don't even recognize it a lot of times. So it's really fun to come at it from afar and try to see it as one of these places of crime fiction, like we've done with, San Francisco and LA and Miami, etc. And it's really surprising and exciting to think of this place as not only my home city in a way, but also a place that has some real good quality noir and crime fiction literature that doesn't seem to be well known or as well known as it should be.
Well, you're definitely right about that because, when we first talked about this episode, you do a little just quick Google search. And if you type in Chicago Noir, it's not abundantly clear what's available. Whereas, if you typed in LA or New York or something, it's quite obvious what falls under that category. But we'll get to all that in just a minute. Listeners, I did want to say just one quick word here before we got too far into the episode. Now, we normally ask you for reviews at the end of the episode. And I would like to appeal to our regular listeners, and I know that there's a lot of you out there because we can see the numbers. I would appreciate if some of you could go on to iTunes and leave a positive review for us. Lately, we've had a couple of interactions with people who were not so excited about the show for various reasons. Their voices heard. So I would appreciate if those of you who like this show, who appreciate the fact that we just do this project because we enjoy the topic. We don't fill you full of ads or promotions or any of that kind of stuff. If you could just take that 5 or 10 minutes and go leave a review on iTunes, that would be greatly appreciated. And just a brief note as to, what some of these people have an issue with of the show is that sort of the tools of analysis that Justin and I sometimes use for evaluating this literature. And, it is true that Justin and I use the elements of analyzing literature sometimes from a perspective of looking at race, class, and gender. And that's a very useful tool. And you'll see that there's decades of academic research that has given us a richer understanding of everything from crime fiction, like we're talking about, to military history, using those kinds of tools of analysis. So it's not for everybody. And if that's not something you are interested in, then, maybe this isn't the show for you. That's fine. But that's something that we're going to look at crime fiction. We're going to use that kind of lens often on this show to look at crime fiction. So anyway, listeners, if you could leave those reviews, that would be great. And we appreciate all of you who tune into the show regularly and support the show. So, with that, unless Justin has anything else to say about that, we'll get into more on Chicago Noir.
No, I've said plenty about that issue individually with some people, so I'm good. That was a good comment by you, Kurt, and I do definitely appreciate the listeners out there. Thanks for being there. It makes this much more enjoyable to have you. So what do we want to do now, Kurt? Do you want to talk a little bit about what we think about when we think about Chicago Noir?
Yeah, I think so. And you mentioned your connection to Chicago, which is certainly more intimate than my own. But I do think it's interesting that you grew up relatively close to the city, whereas I grew up sort of in Wisconsin, in Northeast Wisconsin, at sort of the edge of of Chicago's sphere of influence over the Midwest. Like, we had a lot of tourists from the Chicago area who had summer homes or visited our area. So it was an intimate, like, the idea of Chicago and who people from Chicago were an intimate part of my childhood. And when I thought of what a big city was in America, it was certainly, Chicago, and at least as a child, Milwaukee and Chicago were some sort of one amorphous blob in my mind.
Sure.
And they are kind of one of the mega cities of America, really. But yeah, Chicago, I mean, it's definitely a noir city. I mean, it's the home of Al Capone. I mean, what more do you need, really?
If only that was at stake, then you could make that argument. But there's even more than that, and that's what's so compelling about Chicago. It's a rail center. It was one of the key points in the migration west, and as we've talked about in previous episodes, this westward expansion, this migration, the Old West, the colonial settlements gave rise to the cowboy and Indian wars. They gave rise to the lone sheriff defending his turf, and a lot of times these tropes gave way to the urbanity of detective fiction, and a lot of crime fiction is actually built off this frontier idea and the lawlessness that comes from that. And Chicago is one of the epicenters of that historical lawlessness, like you said, the gangster culture of the 20s and 30s, trying to transcend prohibition and sort of claim like the main power in the city. There's the corrupt police forces going all the way up to modern times. There's the hardcore segregationism in the city. There's so many elements to that city that make it, sort of like a capital of the Midwest, though I say that almost with intent of alienating or pissing off people who live in Minneapolis or St. Louis or Milwaukee, but I do that with a wink. But yeah, there's just so much here to chew on. This city, this epicenter, this place that set up the expansion and pretty much the development of the rest of the West.
Chicago as a city, the one thing that comes to my mind that in what you just said, it's all true, but it's a city of commodities, right?
Oh, yeah.
That is the basis of Chicago. It was the hub of raw material and agricultural production and all of those things in the rise of America as a nation. And that's where its wealth is built out of. That's why the commodities exchange is in Chicago. It's not in New York City.
Yeah.
It's in Chicago.
Yeah.
And, that goes back to those Upton Sinclair and writing about the stockyards. Mm-hmm. All of those things to me just contribute to this, true history of Chicago as a rough and tumble working class city that's built on industry, but also commodity.
Yeah.
Wheat, beef, all of those agricultural products that are filtering in from the rest of the Midwest, especially.
Oh, I agree. I think it's one of the cities that is most born and maintained by capitalism. It's a city that would not be the same if it weren't for the motivation created in a capitalist economic system. Like you said, all those commodities, and it's not just. It has this notion in the writing that we've read and in sort of its working class demeanor. It has this notion, this idea that it's rooted in the working class, and of course it is. There are many workers there. There are many union movements that have been born there, and radical movements. There's a lot of the drama of the city centers on the struggle between workers and of course industrialists and the wealthy and the elites, and many of them live on the North Shore, and you'll see that in a lot of the crime fiction books we read. You can sort of identify in the geography of the city where the folks who work for a living live, and where the folks who feed off or live off the blood of the working class where they reside. So it's fun to sort of identify the economic dynamics of the city by the books that take place in it.
The clash in Chicago amongst, I just made that comment at the beginning of the show, but it is absolutely true. When you talk about Chicago, you have to talk about the history of the working class, and you have to talk about the history of this clash. And that is so integral, I think, to what makes Chicago crime fiction interesting, because it has that history, and because it's very well known in Chicago, I think better than some other American cities, or at least it was, up until relatively recently, that was a constant struggle within the city of Chicago. So, I think on the other hand of that, because we have these clashes, and we have this, not only do we have this creation of great wealth, Chicago is also the city of corruption. The Chicago machine is, for those who don't know, was the political machine of being elected in Chicago. It was one of the most, and may still be one of the most corrupt political machines in the United States in many ways. And that spills over, of course, into the police departments and even the criminal element and the rest of the city.
Yeah, and the political circles who have run Chicago as a political machine for decades, including the Dailies, especially the elder Daily, who is passed on. But this notion of politics as sort of an impenetrable machinery that can't be breached, and that will always get its way, and that has its fingers in a lot of pockets, making sure that it maintains power. We've seen this before. We sometimes criticize other countries for maintaining these kind of strong-arm politics. Well, here we have Chicago almost perfecting this type of power clinging in the context of its growth over the period of many decades. So very intriguing. I think with capitalism comes crime. They go hand in hand. We have the haves and the have-nots, and in Chicago there's a whole lot of folks that want to be the haves and not the have-nots, and we see that acted out in a lot of the stories we're going to talk about.
And let me ask you this, Justin, just as a reaction. We talked about when you Google Chicago Noir, Chicago crime fiction, it's a little like there's not as much direct articles written about it as, say, if you're looking up Miami crime fiction or New York crime fiction or what have you. And it's not to say that there isn't a ton of crime and corruption in other places, but I just feel like the real history of Chicago is so crime heavy, so corruption heavy, that in some ways, why do you even need to write fiction about it?
I mean, that's a good point. The crime is front page news most of the time, and a lot of the political shenanigans are front and center as well. But I wouldn't say that this is incredibly different from a lot of other cities. All these cities, all large cities, all cities of a certain caliber have these types of issues, but Chicago has almost made a name for it because of its connection to Capone, and the Capone tourism industry is almost like Breaking Bad, where I live in Albuquerque. It's become a thing in and of itself that actually, rather than deterring people from the place, draws them to it. So because of that, you'd expect there to be more of an industry of crime writers hopping onto that bandwagon, and maybe some more exposure, or maybe even a school that specializes in writing crime or mystery fiction. But I don't feel like I might be wrong, but I know there's like the crime fiction conference, Murder and Mayhem, is set in Chicago, and I'd love to go there someday. But that's still a relatively new phenomenon. So perhaps this awareness of Chicago as a wonderful crime center locale, and with a rich and vibrant history worthy of writing about, maybe the writers that have written about it will be recognized in the coming years and decades. Maybe a scene will develop that's a little more coherent, or maybe it's because Chicago always feels historically neglected and maligned as the second city, that this is a further incident of that feeling of being the neglected child of the United States major cities.
Well, with that, maybe let's get into some of the authors that have written about Chicago and done so extremely well, because we've got quite a list to cover today.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that. Who are the classic players of Chicago Noir? Who stands out to you in your research of the early writers that we included in our conversation today?
Well, I mean, I think you can't talk about this without talking about writers like Nelson Algren, Richard Wright, even
Studs Terkel.
yeah, Studs Terkel. I mean, we could go on and on. We're gonna talk about Howard Browne.
Yeah.
We're gonna talk about Frederic Brown, Thomas Dewey, Eugene Izzy, Michael Harvey, and more recently, Danny Gardner. And I'm sure that's just my list. I'm sure you've got some more.
Oh yeah, I do. We're going to talk about Sara Paretsky, who took the hard-boiled detective and made them a strong and independent woman, and started to push issues of gender into what was prior to that a very masculine male form of writing. And so she did that back in 82. We're going to talk about that, and people like Joseph Peterson. And did you already mention Michael Harvey? Because yeah, he's going to come up.
Yes.
Okay, cool. But I think a lot of this really starts with Nelson Algren, not so much because he was some kind of amazing hard-boiled crime writer. To some extent he was, but what we're going to explore is his work, Chicago, A City on the Make, which is more of a prose poem than it was an actual crime novel. It's plotless. There's not a bunch of characters that you glom onto and try to understand through the course of the novel. It's more like a series of photographs that capture Chicago in a very working class way, way back when, captures the grit, captures the dark, seedy streets and the danger and the desperation and the beauty in a way that's really phenomenal. And I feel like Algren's this book, and I would have loved to read more by him, but we simply ran out of time. I think this book really captures not so much how to write crime fiction in Chicago, but how to capture the feeling, the spirit of crime fiction and characters in Chicago. What did you think about this piece of writing?
I think City on the Make is just it's a beautiful piece. As you said, it's a poetic prose history of Chicago. But more importantly, I think this is an interesting example of what today I think in history you would call a history from below.
Yeah.
And that it's first of all, I think because of its the nature of its setup, it's very accessible history to a certain extent. But there's so much to this, what is relatively short novella length poem, but there's so many little details where you could go through certain passages and just pull out tons and tons of very interesting and relevant history of the city. And I was going to do a little, I've got an excerpt here I was going to read.
That'd be great, because I mean, line by line, it's beautifully written. It has alliteration, it has a cognizance of rhythm and meter and rhyme, but also it's so dense with information. Like you said, it's like a history lesson turned into a piece of art.
Yes, and he talks about, ultimately this is an ode, like a love poem to the city, and he describes this as, it's every man for himself in his hired air. Yet once you've come to be part of this particular patch, you'll never love another. Like loving a woman with a broken nose, you may well find lovelier lovelies, but never a lovely so real. Let's see. He also describes like sort of the people of Chicago as, I like this one, the gin soaks, stew bums, and shell-shocked veterans who lurk in the alleys and linger in the weedy wastes underneath the L tracks. It's just such a colorful description of a city, and really, despite its grit, it endears you to the city more than anything else.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I don't think it's strictly grit for grit's sake, but it's actually more of a love poem, even though Nelson famously had a love-hate relationship with the city. This is a very endearing poem, a very endearing piece of writing. Nobody would invest this kind of time in a place that they were neutral about. So there's a lot of feelings here. and he still gets in a couple knocks at the mediocrity of the Cubs, which is a running theme in a lot of the fiction we read, because all of it was written, or most of it was written prior to them winning the World Series in 2016. So even going back to the 30s and 40s, they're still ragging on how shitty the Cubs are, because they were, and were up until just a few years ago. Highly recommended as just a piece that transcends crime fiction. Algren's wonderful. I actually bought The Man with a Golden Arm, which won the National Book Award in the 50s. It's one of his classic works of fiction. I was excited to read it. I did not have time to make it fit it into this schedule for this episode. So I'm sure folks out there have have an interest or have read Nelson Algren and folks like Studs Terkel, and there's Saul Bellow, and like there's a lot of writers that are approaching crime fiction, but not quite crime fiction with relationships to Chicago. And this has also included Richard Wright, who has a strong tie to Chicago, but wasn't known for being a crime fiction writer. That is until this year, when recently they unearthed an unpublished volume by him called The Man Who Lived Underground. It's been held in his archives. It was written in the early 1940s. It's set in Chicago, and essentially one person wrote that it was a direct model for Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. It's been getting incredible reviews. I just bought it today, and I also bought or pre-bought S.A. Cosby's Razorblade Tears, so I'm excited about reading some quality fiction heading into the summer. We didn't get a chance to read Richard Wright's new unearthed crime novel, but I have a feeling that it's going to be pretty fabulous. People are saying likening it to people like Kafka and Dostoevsky, an existential novel dealing with a black man who is accused of murdering a couple white folks and has to retreat to a sewer to hide. So that's the basic premise. I can't speak to it beyond that, but pretty cool that came out and that's now available for all of us.
Well, that does sound pretty interesting, and I look forward to your review. Well, let's maybe start by looking at some of the writers and books that actually took place in this sort of the golden age of fiction in that post-World War II boom. And I think you've got Halo and Brass to talk about, huh, Justin?
Yes, I do. So if there was one book that I was trying to find, that book about Chicago that featured a Chicago PI that had the same vibe, the same sensibilities and feeling that Chandler has in LA, that Hammett has in San Francisco, this is the book I was looking for, this series. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it before I even tell you about it. But this is the Paul Pine series, and it was written by Howard Browne. He went by the alias of John Evans, so if you have a copy of Halo and Brass with the name John Evans, it's the same book. He's best known as a sci-fi and pulp fiction editor. He later wrote for Hollywood, several screenplays, many movies. You'll find a lot of his old pulp fiction on Project Gutenberg. You could just, search for it on Google under both his real name, Howard Browne, and several of his aliases. Anyway, this is book 3 in a series featuring Paul Pine, a PI from Chicago. And this book starts off not in Chicago, but in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I immediately got scared. I was like, oh, fuck, I made a poor decision. This dude's decided to take a vacation for book 3. But we're not in Nebraska for long. He, meaning Paul Pine, the detective, he's summoned to the home of a missing girl, a young woman. And he speaks with the parents and learns that the young woman went missing the previous year. And the rumor is she might be in Chicago. He asks around Lincoln, asks around a local brothel. Somebody gets word that he's on the prowl and tries to kill him. He barely escapes Lincoln with his life. And then we're in Chicago. And I think that Pine captures Chicago fairly well. I would have liked a little bit more setting. If we talk about what makes Chicago noir, I will speak to the incredible importance of really establishing that setting, really showing Chicago. Chicagoans would really appreciate it. There's so much about Chicago geography that matters. And sometimes in this book, I did feel that we were so focused on making a very clever plot that Browne forgot to incorporate the stuff that makes Chicago a uniquely beautiful and interesting city. That being said, I think that this novel is a really, really good example of a detective fiction novel set in the Midwest. I think that Browne creates a character in Paul Pine who is distinct from Chandler and Hammett. It's not just a copy. Some people say that in the first 2 books, Pine was essentially Chandler, and this is the first book where he breaks free from that confinement and is able to become his own character. But there are also incredibly interesting characters in this book. There's lots of nightclub owners, mayor's wives, limo drivers, dancing girls, precinct cops, cat house denizens, tough guys. We're in the North Shore dealing with the very wealthy, the power brokers of the city, and that sort of felt like Chandler. That felt like Marlowe going to L.A. mansions, Sternwood or whatever his name was, to interrogate the rich. Similar situation here. This series might deserve its own show, but I'll stop there and say that the plot was really fascinating. And Browne even mentioned that his whole goal in his later work was to do the following. This was actually a blurb on the cover of book number 3. You'll probably think you know the answer when the payoff comes, but you'll be wrong. Browne made it a goal of his to totally befuddle you, make it impossible for you to figure out the mystery. And hey, he was correct with me, but I'm easy. I read and I like to be swept away. I'm not trying to solve the novel, usually a mystery novel, but still, I think he was clever with the way that he handled the material. Only one part of this novel I didn't love, and it's that Browne sort of tactlessly and dismissively used lesbianism and homosexuality as a negative thing and as a way to sort of develop his plot in this book. He wrote in the 1980s that he wouldn't have been able to write that novel in the modern times, that he was of the status quo and he actually held some of those beliefs, and the implication in his foreword was that he wouldn't have done that. Now he's learned his lesson on that. But if you can handle that or recognize that that's going to be a part of it, that he's going to sort of be dismissive and treat homosexuality as a bad thing, then I would say that this novel makes up for it by being a really clever, original sort of take on the genre. So I give it a 4 out of 5. I give it a solid hit. And I heard that the next book in the series, The Taste of Ashes, is even better. Some people consider it one of the best examples of detective fiction in the genre. So I'm really excited to check that out as well.
Yeah, I read this one as well, Justin, and I won't add a whole lot to what you said because I think you gave it a pretty fair shake there. I was a little less, I guess I was impressed more with the potential of this one. And as you mentioned, there's a significant number of books in the series. So I would love to check those out because if it develops further, that's great. I kind of would have given this one a 3.5 hits out of 5, maybe. And I'm also rating mine today on a 5 Chicago dogs out of rating system for just how Chicago they are.
Hell yeah.
And this one gets a 3.5 dog rating.
Okay, that's fair. I think you sort of dropped the ball with the Chicago set. I like your Chicago dogs. I'm going to run with that.
I've got a couple here from the same time frame, but I did want to mention one that I did not end up reading because it was just too crazy. Somewhere online, it was recommended to me to check out Harry Stephen Keeler.
Yes.
Who writes in an even earlier period than this.
Yes.
But his stuff is kind of off the wall. For an example, a book I had downloaded but didn't get to was The Mystery of the Fiddling Cracksman, which is about a fiddling safecracker, and there's something about a volcanic island, and it's over the top, weird, pulpy stuff. If that's your thing, I would maybe check out Harry Stephen Keeler. I haven't yet. So listeners, if you've read him and you think that'd be great for the show, let us know. What I did read was a book by Thomas Dewey. This came out in 1947, and that's Draw the Curtain Closed. And this is, now I wasn't sure if this is supposed to be Mac Detective or the Detective Mac series. I'm going to guess Detective Mac series. It's the first one in this series. There's 18 books overall. Dewey was born in Indiana in 1915. He died down in Arizona in 81. And he was known for 2 major series, this being one of them. Now, I'm not going to get too much into this because I think it's a fairly standard detective story. We have sort of there's a mobster who's gone legit, the mobster's wife, a redheaded hot cabaret singer who gets involved in this plot. There's a few murders and a priceless book. That's kind of the pitch. Things move around Chicago. Sure, the plot here is not significantly great, but what I will say is that I think that Dewey does an excellent job of bringing the setting of Chicago into place. It felt perfect to me to be reading a book from 47 when we're talking about a former gangster. So, this is 15 years or so after, no, more than that, a few years after Prohibition anyway, long enough that he's supposed to have gone legit, but has he really? No, probably not. And Dewey's been called an underrated author, and I can see that. I think that if you want a classic hard-boiled detective story set in Chicago from this period, you should definitely be checking out Thomas Dewey. And I think the series holds a lot of promise. Is this a classic? Yeah, I think it is. I think it's a classic that doesn't do a whole lot of innovation, but it is a classic detective story, well told. I give the book itself, I'm going to say 3 to 3.5 hits. But I'm going to give it 4.5 Chicago dogs out of 5 because I think it really packed in a full meal of Chicago into the writing. That's draw the curtain closed.
I did not read any Thomas Dewey this time around. I'm excited to check that one out. Do you have another one for us?
I do. Also from 1947, this is The Fabulous Clip Joint from 1947 by Frederic Brown. This won the 1948 Edgar Award for the best first novel, so it should have some promise based on that award. Mm-hmm. And I think it does. I think this is a novella length book. What happens here is you have a main character of Ed Hunter, who's a coming of age boy whose father basically just gets killed in an alley at the beginning of the book, right? Well, the police aren't going to really do a whole lot to find the killer, but enter Ed's uncle, Ambrose Hunter, who is a vagabond fellow who's currently working for the carnival, and he comes to town to help Ed solve the murder of Ed's father, Ambrose's brother. And what I liked about this is that it's both a crime novel, but it's also sort of a coming of age novel where Ed learns that there's a lot about his father that he didn't know. And a lot of that is coming from his uncle. And we find out that Ed's father had traveled around the world. He had all these various odd careers, that he'd been in love and fallen out of love and found his, all of this stuff before his mother and he and his brother, his sister, came along. So I really like it as how it's told in a fairly short novella from Browne. And this is actually, and I didn't know this until just the other day, but this is the start of a 7 novel series. So you have a lot to find out if you can track these books down anyway. The first one's easy, the rest are harder. But these Ed and Ambrose Hunter novels, I really enjoyed it. I just thought it was a fun little novella. I think it's definitely a classic. And also this one delivered very much on the Chicago front. I'm giving this one also 4.5 dogs out of 5. I liked it. Fabulous clip joint. What is a clip joint?
I don't know.
I mean, they don't ever really describe that in the book, so I don't know. But anyway, easy to find as an ebook. Good recommendation for this one from Frederic Brown.
I had that as well, and I actually started to read it until I realized that it wasn't on my list of primary reads, so I stopped. And I was going to come back to it if I had the extra time, and I did not. But just to be clear, I did look up clip joint. A clip joint is an informal noun to describe a nightclub or bar that charges exorbitant prices.
Okay.
So it clips dollars right out off of your wallet and into their hands or something like that.
Thank you, old slang.
Exactly. So cool. We're capturing the sort of early days of classic detective and hard-boiled noir, but it wasn't all that. And there's a lot of good stuff that's come out in recent years that are worthy of our attention. So I want to talk about somebody who's sort of in that middle ground. This first book came out in 1982. It's called Indemnity Only, and the author in question is Sara Paretsky. This is one of those names. I mean, she's so popular. It's so mainstream. I see her books when I used to work in libraries. It was on all the shelves. I got the impression that this was not an incredibly quality book. I thought it might just be another Patterson novel. But the fact is that this was a special series. It features private detective V.I. Warshawski, a woman detective, and a hard-boiled woman detective at that. This is the first, or arguably the first, crime novel series to feature a strong woman protagonist who drinks, fights, talks smack, holds her own against enemies bigger and far more powerful than her. I'm assuming that this is not the best book in the series. Kirkus Review called it rather flat, and I would agree with that in terms of some of the writing. It just felt like more trying to get the plot in order rather than focusing on the quality of the writing. But I would say it's a great foundation to build on, and I was really happy to have found it. just so we know about Sara Paretsky herself, she grew up in Kansas. She got a bachelor's at the University of Kansas, and then she moved to Chicago in the 60s to do some community work, and ultimately she got a PhD in history from the University of Chicago and married a guy who was a professor at UC later on, and so really developed the Chicago identity over time. She is widely credited for transforming the image of women in crime fiction, and one of our big criticisms about a lot of the books we've read in the classic or golden age of crime fiction is that women serve as plot points. They serve as objects to help guide or shape the narrative or the character who is usually male. And this is a book written by women, about women, for women, but it's also an incredibly fun, violent, rough, exciting read. And I don't think I'd be surprised if there was anybody who was like, oh, that's too much of a cozy. This is a hard-boiled novel, and it's fucking good. So I'll give you a bit of the premise and then talk about my general feeling about it. Vi is a detective. We don't really get too much about her backstory. This isn't let's explore her origin. We just see her on a case. She's hired by this guy, John Thayer. That's how he identifies himself. He's like a fancy bank president or something. His son is missing a girlfriend. His son's girlfriend went missing. Her name's Anita. She's tasked with finding this gal, and she does, or at least she seeks to. But instead of finding Anita, she ends up finding Peter, the son, with a bullet in his head. And then it turns out that John Thayer, the guy who came to her office, wasn't Thayer at all, but actually Anita's father, who's a local labor leader and adversary of Thayer. So all of a sudden we have this real tightly wound, complex issue related between banking and insurance industries, and we have labor leaders and the working class, and we have these two kids sort of caught in the middle between these men's games. This kid Peter was a radical. He was a student radical leader of the union movements, and worked for Thayer's insurance company, and that insurance company had illegal connections perhaps with the labor leader and some other mobster types. Vi gets roughed up. She gets in a few fights in this story, and some of them she escapes unscathed, but sometimes she gets her ass kicked. It's fun to see. It's fun to see her take risks and defend herself. It's just that shouldn't be shocking, like, to see in a crime fiction novel in the modern days, but it's refreshing to see, and it reminds me of how rare it is to find it in these novels. So a bunch of more shit happens, but really you've got the basic premise of the plot, the basic complication. There are a shitload of characters in this book. There's bankers and insurance folks and assistants to bankers and assistants to insurance folk, mafia guys, labor leaders, suspects, boyfriends, girlfriends, daughters, sisters. There's a whole bunch of people to make things confusing for us. It's not usually my favorite thing. I'd rather have less characters and more development of those characters. But I would say that I think that Paretsky does a fairly good job of tying it all up. And this is really a book about women, supporting girls, supporting women as they grapple with and overcome even limitations of a society ruled by men. There's a lot of that in this book, but it isn't about women's empowerment so much as it is empowered women doing cool shit and trying to solve some murders. So I have more to say about it, but I'm going to stop there and say, if you want to see a book that's dedicated and set in Chicago, this is definitely that. Regularly, V.I. Warshawski eats in Chicago restaurants. She's in Chicago neighborhoods. She's talking to Chicago people about Chicago things. There's a running concern regarding the Chicago Cubs losing. We end up in southern Wisconsin for a little bit, and even that's fairly well developed. And we're also in the North Shore dealing with the wealthy, the elite of the city. She knows her geography, and it's really well captured here. I would say that I like Vi a lot. I think she's tough, no nonsense, but she also takes pleasure in life. She eats food and she screws people, but it's not really central to the plot, and it doesn't problematic in any way. It's just part of her being a fully developed person. So I would give this a solid hit. I would give it a solid 4 Chicago dogs. No fucking ketchup.
Yeah, that sounds pretty interesting. It's kind of surprising with all those elements that it somewhat falls flat, but still interesting elements. And I have one here from roughly the same period, and that is King of the Hustlers by Eugene Izzy. I don't think I actually pronounced this right. It's Izzi, but I want to tell you mostly about the author, and then I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the book King of the Hustlers. But Eugene here, he is a Chicago native. He was born in 1953. He dies in 1996. And he grows up Chicago, blue collar, working class. He's working in the steel mills, Southeast Chicago. And he's got problems with alcohol. He starts writing. And in a relatively short amount of time, he churns out a lot of books. From 87 to 96, he publishes 18 books under his name, and then one series under another name, which I forget, but I think nowadays it's under Eugene Izzy. One of the things that's interesting about this author is that there are conspiracy theories around his death. And some people, and I'll describe that to you, it does involve suicide here. But on December 7th, 1996, he was found hanged outside the window of his 14th story writing office. He was wearing a bulletproof vest. He was wearing brass knuckles and had mace in his pocket and a computer disk with an unfinished book.
Sounds like the opening page of a detective novel.
It does indeed. And now the family does accept that it's a suicide. So I think, that's probably what happens here. But nevertheless, there are conspiracy theories, including the idea that he had infiltrated a white supremacist group and was going to expose them. So, well, now we'll never really know the truth. But what I will say about his writing, and this comes through in the 1989 novel, King of the Hustlers from Bantam Books, is that he really captures the grit of, I would say, from the mid 70s to 80s of Chicago. And I mean, that makes sense. That's what he was living. He has the real experience in these areas of Chicago and he conveys those extremely well on the page in King of the Hustlers. In this book, we have sort of a cast of characters revolving around, culminating in one major score. We have Tone Nello, who's known in Chicago as King of the Cons. We have his buddy, Bobby Beto, who's sort of a ex-hippie tough guy. He's like the tough guy who meditates sort of thing. We've got Edgue Plummer, who's a gang leader who's just gotten out of prison for committing a rape. We've got George Alessi, who's a cop whose father gets murdered fairly violently early on in the book. And we have Pete Panther Painter, who is a junkie, strong-arm guy for Plummer. And all of these characters sort of move around in the same neighborhood. They are all, because of their neighborhood upbringing, they all have connections that go back to their childhood. And the book is really playing off all of this power struggle within the neighborhood and the play to make this giant score that can basically, set them all up for life. Now, did I love the book? Not exactly. I did think it felt a little bit disjointed, but the set pieces were excellent. And I'm giving it a 4 out of 5 because those set pieces are so good. But what this book did, probably the best of any book that I did read, was give me Chicago. This gives me a full 5 out of 5 Chicago dogs, or if you will, and you know the reference, this is a full-on hot dogs for Chicago. I did love that. I thought that this really brought at least the streets of 80s Chicago to the page and gave me that experience. So that's King of the Hustlers by Eugene Izzy.
That sounds good.
Okay, I think if we want to continue chronologically here, I've got another one, and this is The Chicago Way by Michael Harvey. It was written in 2007. And a little bit of background that does, I think, come through very strongly in this book is that Harvey is, he's a journalist. He's been involved in TV. He is the creator of the show Cold Case Files. And, he was born in Boston, which is one kind of potentially rough and tumble town, and then moves to Chicago. He currently lives there and owns an Irish bar in Chicago, as you do, I guess. Yes.
If you live there for 5 years, you get an Irish bar.
Yes, I believe that's part of the contract, right? So there's 5 books in this Michael Kelly series. This is the first one. In this one, right at the beginning, you have your private investigator, Michael Kelly, sitting in his office, as detectives do. We find out he's an ex-cop, and his old partner knocks on his door and needs help desperately solving a case that this partner worked on 8 years ago. That was a rape and battery case, and almost immediately, the old partner ends up dead. And now Kelly must enlist a group of old friends and also, incidentally, specialists in various, a lawyer, a DNA specialist for the rape crimes unit sort of thing. And they're all brought together to solve this case. Now, if I give you much more than the plot than that, I think it starts to unravel the intrigue that Harvey has set up in this book. I really enjoyed this because I think his experience on Cold Case Files really brought an authentic voice to some of the elements in this book, particularly how they went about tactfully and properly investigating and talking about a rape case in the modern sense. And because that is integral to the entire book, I was just glad to see that. I was also glad to see that the science elements of this, it was a little bit more of a CSI type book in certain at certain times, but that was well written. I mean, I don't think that was like super strong, but there was that element to it. And I think in a lot of what we read, because we don't read a lot of police procedurals on this show, we don't really talk about that. And I did think that Michael Harvey covered that material pretty well. I'm giving the book a 4.5 out of 5. That might be a little bit strong, but I think as far as Chicago goes, this is going to get 4 Chicago Dogs out of 5. It's pretty good, but I would have liked a little bit more flavor.
That's good to hear about Michael Harvey. It's funny that I had Michael Harvey on my list of Chicago authors to read for several years now. I picked up a book randomly at Don's bookstore just down the road from my house in Albuquerque. It was called The Third Rail, which is one of his books in the series that I think you're discussing. I was excited about it. I saw that it was set in Chicago, so I said, all right, I'm going to wait until we do a Chicago Noir episode. 3 years later, we do one, and I don't read the damn book because I had so many other books I wanted to read. It ended up making my second tier, and I just didn't have the time for it. So I'm glad that you did. He is one of these, I guess, major modern players in the Chicago crime scene, Paretsky and Harvey and some other folks. So he's a significant piece of that overall puzzle of what is Chicago crime fiction at this juncture. So he's not the only one, though. There's another one that we didn't actually read this time around that I did want to at least mention now. It's Bob Hartley. You might remember that we spoke very warmly of his second book titled North and Central. This was way back in episode 13. It was during the 2-episode discussion that we had for the Maltese Falcon. Anyway, we had this very short-lived discussion section called Helicopter Spotlight, which ended up becoming more like our featured reviews. And we talked about Hartley's novel, which is set in working-class Chicago in the late 1970s. It was put out by Tortoise in 2017. This was the era before Ditka and the Bears and the Millennium Park bean sculpture and all that stuff. This was all about the end of an era, the end of manufacturing and industry. And in this novel particularly, one of the major employers in the neighborhood, Zenith, which made TVs, is about to go under. So that's the setup for the plot. The main character is a guy named Andy. He owns a bar. He also has a terminal illness. He's surrounded by this motley crew of drunks and miscreants, ex-drug addict, younger brothers of ex-girlfriends, old friends, crooked cops, old friends who are crooked cops. There's just a whole melange of really interesting people in this bar. It's sort of like a gritty, more desperate Cheers. And ultimately, the plot revolves around them maybe hatching out a plan to steal televisions from the Zenith plant and selling them on the black market to make a little money. And there's also some cheating that happens that creates some controversy. But I think when I reviewed this book back in 2018, I said it had the feeling of a play. And that's funny because I just looked up whether or not it was ever turned into a play. And while it wasn't, it turns out that Hartley did write a screenplay for this novel because it's currently available on the website called the New Play Exchange, which, quote, is the world's largest digital library of scripts by living writers. So if you are a playwright and you want to write a gritty, desperate version of Cheers set in Chicago in the 1970s, this is the screenplay for you. I would give this book was fucking great when I first read it. I'm going to stick with my original assessment and give it 5 Chicago hot dogs and a really large old style on the side, and maybe a shot of Malort afterwards.
Yeah, that sounds great. We've talked about North and Central before, and it's made both of our, when we did our overview episode, it made both of our lists as one of the best novels we've read on the show. We both really enjoyed it. And I mean, we needed to mention it in this episode because if you want some Chicago noir, you really should check out North and Central. It was very good.
Do you want me to dive into Danny Gardner, Kurt?
Yeah, talk about Elliot Caprice.
All right, so Elliot Caprice is the protagonist in Danny Gardner's series that starts with the book called A Negro in an Ofe, and this came out by Bronzeville Books in 2017. This is a publishing company that Gardner owns, I believe, or has a connection to. Kurt reviewed this book in a 5-round review a while back, a couple years back, and he liked it, but I hadn't read it until now. This is a crime novel that's set in the 1950s. And it opens with Elliot Caprice in a St. Louis jail cell under a fake name. So we get this mystery right away. Well, who is this dude and what's his story? Turns out he's an ex-Chicago cop on the lam who later becomes a private dick, sort of falls into it as he attempts to vindicate himself from some crimes that he's being accused of. Some of it he did, but, was it a setup or not? Out of jail, he returns first to Southland, Chicago, to help the son of Southland's Jewish mafia boss resolve a probate issue relating to a rich estate that resulting from the murder of a patriarch in a wealthy North Shore. This is the part where the book feels like it's straight out of a Philip Marlowe story. But that's mostly a setup to develop Elliot and his situation. Like I said, vibes of Chandler, but there's also a lot of really interesting issues of race and class in this story. Elliot Caprice is a college-educated tough guy. He went to Bradley. He's not just some local schmo who's working at just scraping by. He actually has a brain to understand sort of the complications of the world he's in. He's also a black man, but he has light skin. So there's ideas of racial color hierarchies and code switching that he has to play all the time, depending on whether people he's with think he's white or think he's black or what. So you get a lot of that kind of complication that is exhausting, and it's exhausting to have to see somebody engage in on a regular basis. Tim Hennessy writes in his review of this book that Elliot Caprice is the embodiment of otherness. He's abandoned by his white mother after his black father dies in a race riot. There's a lot of extremes at play, and he's sort of in the middle of it. For that reason, he's a complex character, and I like how Gardner makes Elliot not only interesting, but also empathetic. He wants money, but not just, for himself. He wants money so he can reclaim his uncle's farm from the bank, and that is something I value to help make him, so I can root for him more deeply. I also like Caprice's pal Frank, who he meets in jail, who he beats up in jail. He becomes ultimately his sidekick, but not in a way that's hokey. I actually like their dynamic, and I felt that Frank was a refreshing part of the novel. In short, there are some good gritty scenes, strong dialogue, interesting setting in Chicago proper. The plot felt overcomplicated at times, but that didn't get in the way of what ultimately was a very, I think, well-crafted story. This is a strong hit for me. I'd give it 4.5 Chicago dogs.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed that one, Justin. I enjoyed it when I read it, and that definitely led me to reading the sequel, which came out last year in 2020, Ace Boone Coon. And I won't give you too much more about this, but it really can, because in a way I kind of think that some of the events that happen in the second book could ruin the first book for a reader. So if this sounds interesting to you, go ahead and read Negro and Ofe. If you've already read Negro and Ofe and you enjoyed it, read Ace Boone Coon. You're not going to be disappointed. I really liked Ace Boone Coon. I would give it probably 4.5 out of 5. The only issue I had with it is it does flow fairly quickly from the first book, and I did find myself trying to read desperately to remember who some of the characters were. So if you're going to read these, I would read them fairly close together, and I think you'll have a better experience. But it continues the story of Elliot and many of the characters from the first book. We get a lot more. A lot of this centers around the Southland, as you mentioned. And I'm not sure historically, like if that is supposed to be a specific place, but that Southland area of Chicago is now, it is the southern suburbs, south and west suburbs of Chicago. It is a predominantly black community. I looked online here as one of the highest rates of black homeownership in the country. And it's also home to many other immigrant communities, or I should say many immigrant communities who are moving into the Chicago area. So may have I'm not sure how much of it's made up and how much of it isn't. But if some of the events that happen in the second book, if they're historically true, I want to read more about the real history of what happens in Southland area around Chicago. Okay, so as we said, we both highly recommend Danny Gardner's Tales of Elliot Caprice. And I think we have one more review for you today, and then we'll wrap things up.
Yeah, we have one more. And this was really, really fun. I'll admit, I enjoyed visiting Chicago Noir in a lot of ways for the first time, trying to understand who's who. That's what these episodes are really good for. I hope folks out there also agree that it's fun to just dive into an unfamiliar territory and try to understand it. Who are the players? What are they doing? Why does it work? The last author I'm going to review is Joseph G. Peterson, and his novel is Gunmetal Blue. And this was also published by Tortoise Books, the same press that put out Hartley's North and Central. In fact, it was Bob Hartley himself who recommended this book to us when I did a reach out for recommendations on Chicago Noir on our Point Blank Facebook page. So thanks, Bob, for the rec. It was definitely worthy. Just a little background on Peterson. He grew up in the Chicago suburb of Wheeling. He worked in an aluminum mill and in the masonry trade before attending the University of Chicago. He writes novels. He's written several. He's also written some short stories. But this is the novel that I read. And it features a fractured narrative that is not chronological in its organization. This is sometimes jarring to some readers. If you just want a straight detective yarn, this isn't it. This is a book that's a little more meta, that sort of explores detecting and the notion of the detective protagonist from a different angle that's more existential and more postmodern. It centers on Detective Art Top. He's an incompetent private detective who finds his wife shot to death in his own office. He has a 22-year-old daughter who hates him, a dead-end friend named Cal who loves guns, especially Uzis, and lives with his mom. And there's also a gal pal named Rita who doesn't seem to trust or like him much. Art is facing an existential crisis in the wake of his wife's death. He contemplates his own role in her murder. Is her death the result of his choice to become a private detective? Prior to that, he worked a dead-end office job, and they let him go. And he chose on a whim to become a private detective. And she wasn't really into it. She said, why? What an absurd decision to make. He doesn't have those skills or those attributes that might make him successful, but he chose it anyways. Perhaps she died as a result of the Glock 26 that Cal gave him as a gift. Cal didn't want him to quote-unquote shoot his pussy gun anymore. He just had a crappy 22 Ruger that wouldn't fire straight. Cal wanted him to have a good gun. Well, it turns out that good gun was what was used to kill his wife. So, who was the killer and what was Art Top's role in that death? Is Art a narrator who we can trust? It's a first-person story, so is he a trustworthy narrator, or is he deliberately hiding or attempting to deceive us? That's something we have to think about throughout the course of the narrative. As the story goes on, the protagonist, Art, looks to solve the murder. We get scenes of him with his wife in their early years, but most of the time we're with him as he's looking to reluctantly solve the case. Sometimes we're in the past, sometimes we're in the present. Things he thinks about now remind him of the past, and all of a sudden we're in a past scene. So that issues of time and space really matter in this book. You're all over the place. So it can be disorienting. You have to pay attention. But I don't think it's ever too complicated that Peterson doesn't steer the ship straight when he needs to. Ultimately, I love how Peterson captures the grief of loss in a broken, distant narration. I love the fractured narrative that shows trauma as a puzzle to be reconstructed. There's almost a meditative quality to reading the way that he writes, and it's something I really appreciate as a writer. I love how this fractured structure stimulates plot, and I think that if this story was told chronologically, it would not have as much impact. I also appreciate, and this is the part that some people complain about, Peterson's interrogating gun violence. He's putting this gun on a pedestal, and he's putting these existential questions that Art Top asks about gun violence into the spotlight. He's scrutinizing guns. And I get it, and I think that's important. As a gun-owning leftist, I don't feel that his analysis is necessarily systemic enough. It seems to be more that he's attacking the fact that we can get guns and not so much questioning how guns in a system that's unjust and that creates a lot of suffering perpetuates conditions for violence to flourish. Still, I find this book very much recommended. Kirkus calls it skillfully calibrated and oddly compelling. I agree with that. I would give this 4.5 Chicago dogs.
Interesting. Sort of reminds me in a certain way of The Gun that I read a really long time ago by Japanese noir, Nakamura, I believe.
I agree. I think those books would be interesting to read side by side to see how they speak of the same issue. They're both sort of philosophical in their approach.
That was on my list. Didn't get to it because we had so much to cover today. But I mean, I feel like we're kind of rushing it here, listeners, but we don't want to talk too long. But I think we've really given a pretty good sample of a lot of what Chicago has to offer. And there's a ton that we did not cover. I mean, if we were trying to do a single episode on LA or New York, we would feel just as rushed as we are today with Chicago Noir. But really, it's quite a body of work. I knew this would be exciting, and I think I was not let down by the offerings that we had. What about you, Justin?
I would agree entirely. I've been let down in the past. I've either done poor research or I didn't find authors that really spoke to the episode that we were doing. In terms of this, we went in sort of blind. We had a couple ideas. Our readers really came in to help us. They offered some great direction when we reached out looking for Rex. We also did our own research and found some really good stuff. Like I didn't give many books I read a 5-star, like through the roof review. I'm in love with Dorothy Hughes' writing, and I gave her a lot of 5 stars. I didn't give anybody 5 stars except for Hartley this time around, but I didn't give anybody below 4 stars either. So I would say a pretty consistently solid, strong crop of writers that represent Chicago, the Chicago setting, references to Chicago food and drink, these things that we talked about. Certain things that make Chicago Noir what it is seem to be well captured by the books that I discussed, at least this time around. And I was really satisfied with what we found. And I think we could easily do a Chicago Noir 2 in 50 episodes and probably have as much to talk about it with entirely different authors.
Certainly. And what you said with the caliber of the writing is that, I didn't read any duds here. Same experience you had. I had no 5 out of 5s for actual writing content, but many of these really succeeded in giving me a sense of place and bringing me to the streets of Chicago, bringing me down to the skyscrapers and the lake and the pier and the gritty alleys of Chicago, and also transforming me through a time, because Chicago is certainly not the same city it was 40 years ago or 60 years ago or 100 years ago. And I think these books did also invoke that time element very well for me. So yeah, great visiting Chicago. I think with that, we can move into what we have to look forward to in the future.
Future episodes. We had a lot to read this time around. Next episode, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to focus on one book, and that book is Miami Blues by Charles Willeford. This is Miami Noir. This is early 80s. This is humor. This is violence. I'm excited about returning to Florida and returning to Charles Willeford, and a guy that we haven't devoted a whole episode to, and figuring out what his deal is. So that's episode 59. Episode 60, we catch our breath. We do some 5-round reviews. This is where we, review some of the books that we've read that don't necessarily fit into one of the episodes. So we can all just catch our collective breath before we dive into another subject unknown where we do ecological noir. This is a term that we mostly sort of made up in that it's not a widely recognized genre. This could include noir that involves issues of climate change or environmental devastation in modern times. It could be noir or crime fiction that heavily incorporates environmental themes. Both me and Kurt have a background and an interest in environmental and ecological studies. So how do writers successfully bring those issues to a novel that is also gritty or hard-boiled, that is also compelling and well-plotted, that has crime, that has violence, that has interesting things to say? It's been a challenge to figure out which books to read for this, but we do have a short list, and we'll share that with you once we get closer to that date. And the last episode that I'm going to mention here is number 62. We do another deep dive featuring a singular author. This author is Ed McBain, and his book Cop Hater, which is the first of his police procedurals in the 87th District series. Those of you who like police procedurals and wonder why we never talk about them, well, the fact is we don't talk about them because we don't read them. They don't appeal to us. We wanted to give one of the classics a shot and see how it holds up. So that's the short term for our future. How do folks contact us, Kurt?
Well, the best way to find us is probably on Facebook. We have 2 pages on Facebook. One is the main one for the show. That's mostly announcements. A discussion happens on our Point Blank group, and you have to request to join that. But that's where most of people who listen to the show and want to comment on various things or share books they're reading, that's where they share that information. And there's a nice little community there. Not too many posts, but just enough to keep you interested. That's on Facebook. If you want to get in touch with us and ask a question, or I guess send us a rant, you can do that at Gmail, pointblanknoir@gmail.com. Depending on what you have to say, hopefully it's constructive. We would be happy to have a dialogue with you there. And other than that, there is a Goodreads group as well, but that seems to be transitioning more towards the Facebook group recently. So we thank you once again for tuning in and listening. And don't forget, if you can, leave a review on iTunes. We would greatly appreciate that and could use a couple more recent positive reviews.
All right, folks, enjoy a couple shots of Malort. Go eat a Chicago hot dog without any ketchup. Go eat a tavern cut piece of pizza. Skip that deep dish shit. That's tourist stuff. And have a wonderful beginning of your summer, or whenever it is that you're listening to this podcast. We look forward to seeing you again in a couple weeks.
See you next time.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.